You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the third test between Australia and South Africa from the SCG. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the match summary from the third test between Australia and South Africa from the SCG. Australia batted first and made 4 for 475 declared. Khawaja top scored with 195 not out, and Nortje took 2 wickets for South Africa. South Africa in their first innings were bowled out for 255. Maharaj top scored with 53. Hazlewood took 4 wickets for Australia. South Africa were asked to follow on, and they finished on 2 for 106 in their second innings. Irvie top scored with 42. Hazlewood and Cummins took 1 wicket each. The match was a draw. Australia won the series 2-0, and Usman Khawaja was named Player of the Match. What were the key moments and key factors from this third test between Australia and South Africa? Australia's batting, setting 4 for 475 declared to put themselves into a dominant position. The weather was a big factor, taking time out of the test match and making it harder for a result to be achieved. Australia's bowling to bowl South Africa out for 255 under the follow-on target of 275 allowed Australia to enforce the follow-on and push for an unlikely victory. But time and the weather were Australia's enemy, and the test match ended in a drab draw. Those were the key moments and key factors from this third test at the SCG. Let's have a look at both teams' performances in this third test at the SCG with both bat and ball. We'll start with Australia and their batters. Khawaja 195 not out, Warner 10, Labuschagne 79, Smith 104, Head 70, and Renshaw 5 not out. That's how the Australian batters went about things in this third and final test of the series against South Africa at the SCG. Australia's batting in this third test at the SCG was another dominant display from the Australian team. It was reflective in the score they amassed in this third test match. 4 for 475 declared from 131 overs was a pretty dominant performance with the bat from Australia. Let's talk about Australia's batting performance and what happened in the first innings with the bat. How did they go about things? They scored 4 for 475 declared in 131 overs, as I mentioned. And as I mentioned as well, it was a pretty dominant performance. As we've seen throughout the series, Australia have been able to post big first inning scores to really put South Africa under pressure. And that was evident in the third test here at the SCG. David Warner went early for 10 and missed out as the other batters cashed in and scored big runs in this first innings for Australia. He was the only one who really missed out, really, whereas Khawaja, Smith and Head scored hundreds and well-deserved 50s. Also, Labuschagne scored a 50 as well. So David Warner was unlucky. He was out for 10 after making 200 in Melbourne. The third test match here in Sydney, got out for 10, missed out on a big score. But the partnerships Australia had of 135 for the second wicket between Khawaja and Labuschagne, 209 for the third wicket between Khawaja and Smith, 112 for the fourth wicket between Khawaja and Head were the key partnerships to get Australia to that 4 for 475 score, which they made in the end. And those 3 partnerships were pretty handy for Australia, as I mentioned, and put Australia in a very strong position to try and force a result in this test match, given the rain and the time lost during the 5 days of play. The time and the weather were making it harder for Australia to try and force a result in this match. Pat Cummins had to declare the innings on day 4, and Usman Khawaja fell just 5 runs short of his double century. But the team had to come first, and both Pat Cummins and Usman Khawaja were pretty cool about that decision and putting the team first in order to try and win the test match for Australia. So that's how Australia went about their batting performance in the first innings. As I mentioned, pretty dominant performance, not surprising as we've seen throughout the series. The Australian batters have been scoring a lot of runs. And let's talk about the man of the moment, and that's Usman Khawaja. 195 not out he made. He had a quiet summer up until this point of the summer. Usman Khawaja had a pretty quiet series against the West Indies. He had a quiet 2 test matches at the start of this series against South Africa, but he was able to back the process, back himself, and be able to score 195 in this last test of the series. He batted well. He made batting look easy. As we know with Usman Khawaja, he's quite laid back. He just makes batting look so easy. He was scoring runs well. He was rotating the strike well. He was picking off the South African bowlers at will when they strayed off their lines and lengths. He was able to punish them to the boundary and score runs. But he does it in his own sort of way, really. And it's good to see Usman Khawaja really start 2023 on the right note by scoring a big century. And no doubt he'll be pleased with how he went in this test match with the bat. And he was quite exceptional, Khawaja. Steve Smith, let's talk about him. Brilliant century, 104 of 192 balls. His 30th test match century. He's equalled with Matthew Hayden now on the all-time list of test centuries scored for Australia. And no doubt Steve Smith's going to add another few to that tally of 30 centuries in his career, with a big tour of India coming up, WTC final potentially, and later on in the year, the big Ashes series, of course, in England. So no doubt Steve Smith will definitely climb the list on the all-time century scorers for Australia in Test cricket. But 30 Test centuries is a magnificent achievement. He's now the 4th leading run scorer for Australia in Test cricket. He went past Michael Clarke to go into 4th place on that list. The 3 others ahead of him, of course, are Ricky Ponting, Alan Border, and Steve Waugh. 3 brilliant players and 3 brilliant batsmen for Australia over the years in Test cricket. So for Steve Smith to be in that echelon, that top echelon of Australian Test batters in terms of runs scored for their country in Test cricket, it's a pretty good list to be on. And no doubt Steve Smith will make his way up. Probably may end up in 2nd place on that table. You never know. Or he may go past Ricky Ponting, but that's further down the track. But for Steve Smith, magnificent century. It wasn't really a dominant series from Steve Smith. It was a pretty quiet series. He scored an 80-odd in Melbourne on Boxing Day. Wasn't able to get the century in that test, but he was able to convert here in Sydney. So it wasn't a dominant series from Smith. We were expecting a big series from him, as we saw against the West Indies. But that's cricket. Nothing quite goes to plan. But for Steve Smith, I think he'll be very pleased with his efforts in this 3rd test match. Travis Head, what can we say about Travis Head? He came in and scored a quick-fire 70 off 59 balls. And he's striking well over 100 during this series and also during this Australian summer. You know, every time he comes in at number 5, when the team's in a good position, it just allows Travis Head to express himself, play his shots, back himself. We see Travis Head growing in confidence every innings he plays. His batting's improving, but also his off-spin is improving as well. So he's becoming a very handy cricketer with both bat and ball, if required. But good to see Travis Head really doing well. I think for Travis Head, the big test will be trying to do this overseas for Australia in terms of the Indian tour, also the Ashes as well. But for Travis Head, it's been a great summer for him, and not a bad way to end the Australian Test summer with a good half-century, good contribution in the first innings for Australia. And last but not least, let's talk about Marnus Labuschagne. 79 he made. Again, a very quiet series from Labuschagne. Not a dominant series as we predicted after a very exciting series against the West Indies. He dominated there. But the South African bowlers at times got him out early on in his innings, and he wasn't able to get through those tough periods. But he was able to get through it in the 3rd test and score a good 79. So good to see Marnus finish off the Test summer on a positive note. I should say. He got a good delivery from Nortje that just burst up from the surface. It just kicked off the surface and caught the edge of the bat, and he was a bit disappointed to get out that way, Marnus. But you got to tip your hat as a batsman and say, well bowled to the bowler. And no doubt it was good delivery from Anrich Nortje. Once again, there was another dominant batting display from Australia. Usman Khawaja was by far the standout batter for Australia, scoring a career best 195 not out, which set up Australia nicely in this test match. Steve Smith scored his first century of the series and showed why he's one of the best batters going around. Travis Head's golden summer continues, scoring yet another quickfire 50. Australia's batters will be pleased with how they performed in this third test. Let's have a look at the Australian bowlers and how they performed in this third test match of the series against South Africa from the SCG. No wickets for Labuschagne, no wickets for Smith, a wicket for Head, no wickets for Ashton Agar, 4 wickets for Cummins, 2 wickets for Lyon, and 5 wickets for Hazelwood. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things in this third test against South Africa from the SCG. It was a very good bowling effort from Australia in this third test match of the series. Time was against Australia as the rain fell over the 5 days, taking up time in this test match. It was always going to be hard for Australia to try and take 20 wickets and try and force a result in this test match, given the weather in Sydney again, which has been a common theme over the last few years in Sydney, which is no surprise. It was always going to be hard for Australia to take 20 wickets, but they gave it a red-hot crack. They gave it a go, and that's what it's all about in Test cricket. It's all about testing yourself and challenging yourself, and no doubt this was a challenge for Australia to take the 20 wickets and try and force an unlikely result from the Test match. But let's talk about the first innings and how they performed in the first innings with the ball. Australia started their bowling innings on day 4 due to the rain, delaying play and taking time out of the game, so Australia began their bowling innings in the first innings to South Africa on day 4. They had South Africa in early trouble at 4 for 85 inside 38.1 overs. It looked like bowling South Africa out in no time. But South Africa's batters fought hard and made Australia earn their wickets. Australia needed to keep South Africa under 275 in order to force the follow-on, but South Africa were edging closer to that target. The partnership between Maharaj and Harmer of 80 for the 8th wicket was starting to agitate the Australian bowlers to an extent. But Josh Hazelwood was able to break the partnership, and Australia managed to bowl South Africa out for 255 in 108 overs. But that partnership between Maharaj and Harmer took up more time on day 5, and more time was taken out of the game, and Australia were up against it to bowl South Africa out for a second time. The second innings, Australia were able to enforce the follow-on to push for victory. They only managed to pick up 2 wickets, but South Africa managed to hold on for a draw, finishing on 2 for 106, and Pat Cummins was forced to shake hands and call it a day. So that's how Australia went about things in both of their innings in this test match at the SCG against South Africa. So, as I mentioned, with the rain and the weather, Australia just couldn't quite get the job done. Everything was up against them. But as I mentioned, you've got to give it a go. You've got to give it a try. And I thought Australia really bowled well. They gave it their all. And the SCG wicket was a wicket that wasn't deteriorated as much because the covers were on it for most of the test match. The sun wasn't out baking the pitch. The talk coming into the third test match was that the pitch was going to turn square, and both teams played 2 spinners. Australia played Lyon and Agar. South Africa played Maharaj and Harmer. But it didn't really turn as much, or it didn't really break up as much due to the weather. If it did, it would have been a different story, but that was going to be hard for Australia. That it was going to be difficult seeing that the pitch wasn't really deteriorated as much as you would expect if the test match had no rain and we went the full distance over the 5 days. We would have seen the pitch turn a lot more reverse swing, more prevalent. We did see Australia get the ball to reverse a little bit in both innings, and we did see Nathan Lyon and Travis Head to an extent, who bowled some good overs of off spin and really becoming a serious contender to bowl in India when Australia toured there in February, to be that backup spinner or another spin option. They got the ball to turn a little bit, but not as much because of the weather, as I mentioned. But Australia once again did the basics well with the ball. They bowled good lines and lengths. They applied the pressure onto the South African batters throughout the 2 innings. They bowled dot balls to build pressure. They took wickets when they needed. They bowled dot balls and maidens to build that pressure nicely. They executed their plans and skills with the ball. They bowled consistent line and length. And all the Australian bowlers contributed in some way. And Australia had a bit of luck not go their way. There was some umpires' calls, decisions on LBWs that didn't go Australia's way. There was some non-catches that didn't go Australia's way either. Half chances weren't taken. So if all of those things went in Australia's favour, the umpires' calls for the LBWs, for example, that went in Australia's favour, or the non-catches that weren't given when Steve Smith took 2 brilliant catches at slip. Obviously, one at slip early in the test match, and then obviously another one at slip to Nathan Lyon. Both of those catches weren't given out. They were given not out, the soft signal creating a lot of debate. And no doubt a lot of people will talk about that in the coming days and coming weeks, creating a lot of discussion. But if those calls and the half chances that Australia created as well in the field, if all those things went Australia's way, then maybe Australia were a good chance of probably pulling out an unlikely victory. But that's the game of cricket. You need those things to go your way. Didn't quite go Australia's way there. Australia were quite agitated, especially Nathan Lyon picking up those LBW decisions, and he was bowling well. Unfortunately, ball tracking had umpire's call, and he was not happy about it, Nathan Lyon. Very frustrated, and that's understandable. You just need those little 1%ers to go your way. So Australia's luck wasn't quite there throughout the 2 innings to try and get the wickets and try and pull off an unlikely victory. Let's talk about the bowlers and how they went quickly. Josh Hazlewood back into the test side. He bowled extremely well. I thought he bowled well. He got the ball to reverse swing. Just class as always, Josh. Line and length, hits the spot, metronomic. Brilliant to see Josh Hazlewood come back and really make his presence felt in this 3rd test match. Pat Cummins, what can you say about the skipper? He led from the front again. His spell late on day 4 was outstanding, getting 2 wickets of Sondo and Verena. Those 2 wickets were brilliant, and the way that he set them up was good as well. He got the ball to reverse as well, Pat Cummins. Travis Head, bowling some part-time off-spin. He looked threatening, and Travis Head has really proven his case to be a spin option in India when Australia tour there later on in February. So definitely Travis Head's improved his bowling at test level, and he's quite a very handy off-spinner. Nathan Lyon bowled well, didn't get much off from the surface, didn't really get much assistance due to the weather playing a big part there. The pitch didn't really break up as much, but he toured hard, Nathan Lyon. He picked up a couple of wickets in the test. Ashton Agar, who came back into the test side after a 6-year hiatus, he didn't really bowl well, Ashton Agar. Didn't really pick up a wicket. He struggled a bit. He wasn't consistent in his line and length, and people are questioning about his spot in the squad for the India tour. But Pat Cummins has reassured Ashton Agar that he would most likely be a part of the touring squad to India. But what we saw in this test match, you need your second spinner to be threatening. And yes, of course, the conditions were in favour of the spin bowlers due to the wicket not breaking up as much because of the rain and the weather and the covers being on the pitch and the sun not baking the pitch. For Ashton Agar, he was sort of lost, really. He was sort of bowling like he would in T20 cricket, bowling flat and just being inconsistent with his line and length, not really building pressure. You need to do that in Test cricket. You need to build pressure. You need to land the ball on the spot for 6 balls in the over, build pressure, and be predictable, and not be unpredictable, and be prepared to bowl some boring overs. We didn't see that from Ashton Agar, so he's got to work on that if he does get another opportunity in India come February when Australia tour there. But apart from that, I thought the Australian bowlers really toured hard. They gave it a good red-hot crack. Unfortunately, the time and the weather were their enemy, and unfortunately this test match ended in another boring, drab draw. It was a valiant bowling effort from Australia as they tried to take 20 wickets to bowl South Africa out to win this 3rd test. Unfortunately, the weather and losing time meant the test ended in a draw, but you can't fault the efforts of the Australian bowlers trying to push for an unlikely victory. Let's have a look at South Africa's team performance with both bat and ball in this third test at the SCG. We'll start with their batters. Elgar, 15 and 10. Irvi, 18 and 42 not out. Klaasen, 2 and 35. Bavuma, 35 and 17 not out. Sondo, 39, and Verreynne, 19. That's how the South African batters went about things in this third test at the SCG against Australia. I thought South Africa's batting in this third test match of the series was pretty good in terms of their fight and resilience. They still had their problems. They lost wickets. They struggled. As we know, throughout the whole series, they've just been outclassed. Their batters feel like they're out of depth at this level, especially up against a quality attack with Australia. But South Africa were able to show some fight in this test match, and I think it came down to a number of factors. Number one, the pitch. The pitch didn't really break up as much. It was still pretty good for batting. It was pretty much flat. The sun wasn't baking the pitch. The covers were on the pitch. The rain didn't help in terms of the deterioration of the wicket. That was one factor playing in South Africa's favour in terms of we can bat for time and we can just really, drag out this match and bat for a draw, which in the end, that's what happened. Also, they showed some resilience and fight. They faced a lot of deliveries. All of the batters faced a lot of deliveries in their innings, either in the first innings or second innings. So for South Africa, they got something out of this last test match with the bat, but it's been a very poor series with them with the bat throughout the whole entire series. But let's talk about how they went about things in this third test match with the bat. We'll start with the first innings. They were bowled out for 255 inside 108 overs. And for South Africa, this was their longest innings for them in the series in terms of overs faced. 108 overs is the most overs they've faced in the whole series, and also 255 is their highest score for the series as well. South Africa were in trouble early in their innings. They were 4 for 85 inside 38.1 overs and looked like getting bowled out for a cheap score. But they showed some fight and made Australia earn their wickets on an SCG wicket that wasn't offering much for the bowlers, as we mentioned before. South Africa needed to reach the follow-on target of 275 to make Australia bat again. And if South Africa did that, that would have been a psychological win for them, knowing that, we won't be asked to follow on. The partnership between Maharaj and Harmer of 80 for the 8th wicket was getting South Africa to that follow-on target. It also wasted time and decreased Australia's chances of an unlikely victory. But once that partnership was broken between Maharaj and Harmer, South Africa's tail-enders came in and soon collapsed, as we've seen throughout this series thus far, and South Africa were bowled out and well under the follow-on target of 275. Australia, no hesitation, asked South Africa to follow on, and South Africa managed to hold on for a draw, and they finished on 2 for 106 from 41.5 overs, as time and the unlikelihood of a victory were very slim. Both teams decided to shake hands and end the test match, and the match was a drawn test. So that's how South Africa went about things with the bat in this test match. I think they'll be quite pleased with the fight and resilience shown. I thought in the first innings, Simon Harmer and Maharaj batted well. Both of them put on a good partnership of 80, as I mentioned, for the 8th wicket. But those two in particular showed the rest of the South African batters how to really go about things with the bat. And we haven't seen that from South Africa. They've been inconsistent with the bat throughout this series. They've been poor. They haven't done the basics well enough. They've just been outclassed. And they look out of their depth, especially facing Cummins, Stark, Hazelwood, Lyon, Cameron Green, and even Scott Boland in this series. They just looked out of depth. But they showed something here in this test match. They showed some fight. They showed some resilience. And we know and associate that with South African teams is that they're not going to roll over and, quit. They just applied themselves a lot better in this test match. They just grinded it out. They faced a lot of balls. And they were able to get the result that they wanted, which was a draw. But the weather helped them in that regard there. But for South Africa, tough tour for them with the bat, but at least they got something from this last test match. South Africa's batters showed some good fight in this third test. They were able to hold on for a draw with the help of the Sydney weather. Let's have a look at South Africa's bowlers and their performance in this third test at the SCG against Australia. No wickets for Jansen and Harmer, a wicket for Maharaj and Rabada, and 2 wickets for Nokia. That's how the South African bowlers went about things in this third test match against Australia. Once again, South Africa struggled with the ball in this third test match, and also throughout the series we've seen South Africa struggle with the ball. They struggled in Melbourne, and they also struggled here in Sydney. It hasn't been a great tour for South Africa in terms of their bowling. This South African attack is a pretty good attack, and some people have said it's probably the best in the world. We didn't see that throughout this whole series, and we didn't certainly see that in this third test match either. Yet again, conceded another big first innings total in the first innings. And that's been the common theme for South Africa. As we saw in Melbourne, they conceded over 500 runs in the first innings in Melbourne. And they've conceded 400 runs in the first innings here in Sydney. 4 for 475 Australia made. That's a big score to concede in the first innings. They bowled well, South Africa. At the start of the Australian innings, they bowled well. They kept Australia quiet. They didn't let Australia go and really score quickly. They kept the runs down early in the Australian innings. They kept it quiet. They bowled some tight overs. They were starting to bowl in partnerships and starting to do the basics well with the ball, which has been lacking from South Africa throughout the whole entire series. And they were able to do that, build pressure, and really make Australia earn their runs. But unfortunate for South Africa, they weren't able to sustain that pressure for long periods of time. And then obviously Khawaja and Smith and Head and Labuschagne really scored runs, and they took it away from South Africa, and South Africa absolutely struggled from that moment on. As I mentioned, they didn't do the basics well enough, and that's been the common theme from South Africa throughout the whole series. They weren't able to do the basics well enough of the ball. They didn't bowl good lines and lengths. They didn't apply pressure onto the Australian batters throughout the innings. They didn't bowl enough dot balls to build pressure. They took wickets every now and again, but not when they needed them. They bowled some dot balls and maidens, which has been lacking from South Africa, the lack of maidens. They were able to build the maidens up in this test match, but unfortunately they weren't rewarded with any wickets or anything like that. Their plans and skills with the ball, they didn't quite execute them, and they didn't quite bowl a consistent line of length to build pressure. So South Africa, their bowling, yet again, was poor. They came into this test match with 2 spinners, and to be honest, the 2 spinners weren't really effective. Maharaj took his first wicket for the series, obviously getting rid of Steve Smith, caught and bowled. But, you know, his series has been very difficult. He's been leaking runs. He leaked runs here in this third test in Sydney. He leaked big runs in Melbourne. They played Salman Harmer, the second spinner, and I think he was more effective than Maharaj, to be honest. Harmer was getting some turn, and he was causing some problems at times to the Australian batters with his off-spin. More so than Maharaj. But he struggled as well. You know, he conceded over 109 runs in 25 overs. So the spinners weren't really effective. For me, Nokia was pretty good again. He kept steaming in, bowling good pace, and, you know, he's been the standout bowler for South Africa throughout the whole series, I think. You know, he's been one of the best. All the others have been quite poor. Rabada, he's out of form. He hasn't been really at his best, Rabada, throughout this whole series. Jansen has shown some brilliance. He's shown some good spells. He's bowled some good spells throughout the series in Melbourne and in Sydney. But South Africa, this bowling attack just has underperformed in Australia, and that's a disappointing thing, because we know this bowling attack have got some very talented bowlers, but we haven't seen that talent. We've seen it at times in this series, but we haven't seen it on a consistent basis. And in this test match here in Sydney, you know, they've bowled a lot of overs in the field, especially in Melbourne, over 145 overs when Australia batted there, and over 131 here in Sydney. So there's a lot of overs in the legs, and they were starting to tire and fatigue. And after a long tour and series, and especially when you're on the losing side, it can be very difficult to come back and back it up. So not a good bowling performance again from South Africa. It was another poor bowling performance from the South African bowlers in this third test. They haven't bowled at their best in this series. For another year in a row, the Sydney Test ends in another draw. Unfortunately, the rain prevents a result for this third test of the series. Australia tried their best to push for victory in this final test of the series, but will be happy with a 2-0 series win. South Africa showed some fight in this final test and battled hard for a draw. Despite the rain and the disappointment over the 5 days, the McGrath Foundation raised a lot of money to help those battling breast cancer, and no doubt Glenn McGrath will be over the moon with the generosity from the Australian public. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe, and bye for now.